What if I told you that one of the most powerful empires in African history, a nation built on justice, learning, and bravery, became so influential that even colonial powers feared the idea of it? This is the story they rarely teach, the empire they buried in footnotes, the African superpower they never wanted you to know about. Before we begin this journey into courage, conviction, and forbidden history, hit the subscribe button to support more powerful African stories. And remember, your subscription keeps this history alive. Now, let us step into the world of the Sokoto Caliphate. In the 1800s, Hausaland was a land of kingdoms. Kano, Katsina, Zaria, Goba, advanced, wealthy, culturally rich, but divided. The people lived, traded, worked, and prayed, but they lived under rulers who often abused their power. Villages complained about unfair taxes. Scholars warned about rulers who ignored justice. Ordinary people feared a future where the powerful controlled every breath. But in the town of Degal, a man was rising, a man whose ideas would shake West Africa. Usman dan Fodio was not born a warrior. He was born a teacher, a thinker, a reformer. He traveled from village to village, teaching justice, equality, literacy, and community. His message was simple: leadership must serve the people, and the people loved him. But the kings of Hausaland did not. As Dan Fodio's followers grew, fear spread among the ruling elite. Ban his teachings, drive out his followers, silence him. One order changed everything. Usman dan Fodio was declared an enemy of the state. He stood before his followers. This oppression must end. We will resist injustice not for power, but for the people. A moment of silence. And that is how a scholar became a revolutionary. In 1804, Dan Fodio and his followers fled into exile, a migration known as the Hijra to Gudu. They left behind their farms, their books, their homes, but not their courage. Do not fear. We walk toward freedom. In Gudu, something extraordinary happened. They proclaimed him Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful. A new nation was born that day. A nation built not on ethnicity, but on belief, justice, and unity. The Sokoto Caliphate begins. The struggle began as a fight for justice, but it quickly became something far greater. He sent messages across the region: stand for justice, stand against oppression. Kano, Katsina, Zaria, Nup, Adamawa, Gwandu. One by one, kingdoms joined the movement, not because of force, but because the people wanted change. Gober, the empire that once chased Dan Fodio, fell, and with its fall came the rise of something magnificent. The Sokoto Caliphate had begun to take shape, an African empire built on knowledge, discipline, and unity. As the years passed, whispers of dissatisfaction grew louder across the Hausa states. The tension quietly building beneath the surface finally began to show. Markets, once filled with cheerful bargaining, now held uneasy conversations about rising taxes, harsh punishments, and leaders who seemed more interested in power than in the welfare of their people. Ordinary families felt the weight of decisions made far above their heads, and many began to search for a voice they could trust, someone who represented fairness in an age of uncertainty. That trust gradually settled on a humble scholar whose influence had been quietly expanding. People spoke about how his teachings restored hope, how he treated the poor with dignity, and how he encouraged learning for everyone. Women, who were often pushed aside in matters of knowledge, found in him someone who believed deeply in their right to education. Young men were inspired by his calm confidence and the clarity of his teachings. His gatherings, once small circles under the open sky, began attracting hundreds from distant towns. His message spread quickly, crossing ethnic lines. Fulani herders, Hausa farmers, traders, and scholars all felt drawn to the idea of a society built on justice, fairness, and knowledge. And while his words healed the hearts of many ordinary people, they unsettled those in power. The rulers watched his growing influence with distrust. At first, they tried to ignore him. Then they attempted to control him. But nothing slowed the movement he had awakened across the region. When restrictions were issued against his teachings, instead of discouraging the people, it only made them more determined. Parents surged their children to attend his lessons. Travelers carried his ideas from one town to another. The sense of unity he inspired became stronger than fear. and when a series of unfair commands from the throne targeted his followers, directly seizing property, limiting gatherings, and arresting innocent supporters, it broke whatever patience the people had left. They gathered around him, not as mere students, but as a community united by suffering and hope. They were tired of leaders who used intimidation as a shield. They were tired of injustice disguised as authority. And at that moment, he realized that the movement had grown far beyond him. The people wanted change, and they believed deeply that he was the one who could guide them toward it. As pressure increased, the tension finally reached a breaking point. He and his followers could no longer remain in the place they had called home. What began as a peaceful journey for safety turned into a defining moment for the entire region. Families packed what little they could carry. Children clung to their mothers. Men formed protective lines as they moved out together, unsure of what awaited them but certain of what they were leaving behind. Yet even in exile, their spirits did not break. If anything, their resolve hardened. They were no longer just a scattered group of believers. They were becoming a unified force shaped by hardship, strengthened by purpose, and guided by a leader whose wisdom had already transformed their hearts. What lay ahead would reshape the future of West Africa. But in that moment, all they knew was that a new chapter had begun. And there would be no turning back. Their departure sent shockwaves across the region. News of the migration spread faster than expected, carried by travelers, wandering scholars, and traders who had witnessed the growing tension firsthand. People whispered about the injustice that had pushed peaceful families from their homes. And many wondered how far the rulers were willing to go to silence a movement rooted in knowledge and fairness. Instead of weakening the exiles, the persecution only strengthened their unity. What began as a retreat gradually transformed into a rallying point for something far bigger as they settled temporarily in their new location. The movement took on a new life. The people who had followed their leader into uncertainty found renewed purpose. They organized themselves with surprising discipline. Men took up roles in defense, elders offered guidance, women strengthened the community with food, care, and education, and young people immersed themselves in study and training. It was in this period of exile that the foundation of a new vision truly emerged. The leader, once focused solely on teaching, now found himself guiding a community that looked to him for direction in every aspect of life. He spent long nights discussing strategy with trusted companions and long days addressing the concerns of his people. What he once taught in small circles now shaped the social and political fabric of an entire community. And slowly, the idea of a new order, one built on justice, unity, and disciplined leadership, took shape. Meanwhile, word of this transformation reached the rulers who had driven them out. They expected their actions to scatter the group, not strengthen it. Their alarm grew as reports came in. The exiles were not dissolving, they were organizing. They were attracting more supporters from towns and villages where hardship and frustration had been simmering for years. The rulers saw this as a direct threat to their authority. Their response was swift and harsh. Envoys were sent to intimidate the exiles. Demands were issued, insisting that the leader be surrendered to face punishment. But the community refused. They stood firmly with the man who had given them clarity and purpose when their world was full of confusion. For them, turning him over would mean betraying everything they believed in. Tension escalated when hostile forces arrived with orders to break the growing movement once and for all. The attack was sudden and merciless. Horses charged, dust filled the air, and the clash of weapons echoed across the land. But the exiles, though fewer in number, fought with a unity and determination that surprised even their enemies. They were defending more than land, they were defending their right to justice, knowledge, and dignity. Though the battle was intense, the exiles emerged victorious. It was a turning point. Their unlikely success marked the beginning of a new identity. They were no longer refugees. They were no longer a suppressed minority. They had become a force capable of standing on its own, driven by a belief system that united them across clans, backgrounds, and professions. With this victory, hope spread quickly through the region. People who had doubted the movement began to watch more closely. Some offered support, others joined outright, and the leaders of distant towns, witnessing the exiles' resilience, started asking themselves a dangerous question. If justice could rise in one place, why not in theirs? The old order was shaking. and the movement, strengthened by hardship and sanctified by survival, was preparing for the greatest transformation in its history. A transformation that would soon forever reshape West Africa. The victory only strengthened the belief that their movement had been guided by destiny. Among the people, the name of Usman dan Fodio began to carry a new weight. No longer was he seen only as a scholar or teacher. Now he was the moral voice of a growing revolution, one that challenged injustice in a way the region had never seen before. People whispered stories about his courage, his humility, and his unshakable devotion to reform. His teachings spread far beyond the small community that had followed him into exile. Families who had suffered under the oppressive rule of local chiefs and kings made long journeys just to hear him speak. Scholars came to ask for guidance, warriors vowed to protect him, and young people memorized his words with the hope of building a better society. What began as a movement for reform was becoming the foundation of something far greater. As the community expanded, an unmistakable shift occurred. Settlements that had once been scattered now grew into organized towns. Leaders appointed by Usman dan Fodio established systems of justice. Disputes were settled fairly, greed was discouraged, and learning became central to life. For the first time, ordinary people felt seen and protected. They experienced a sense of dignity that had been denied to them under the old rulers. But the rise of this movement terrified the established authorities. The Hausa rulers, kings who had long controlled trade, wealth, and land realized that the influence of Usman dan Fodio was spreading too quickly. His message of justice, morality, and righteousness resonated with their subjects far more than their own promises. To them, this was not just a challenge. It was a threat to the very roots of their power. Allies among the Hausa aristocracy met in secret, warning each other that if Dan Fodio continued gaining followers, their kingdoms would crumble. They issued threats, demanding he abandon his teachings. They restricted his ability to preach. They harassed his followers. But instead of weakening the movement, every attempt that they made, it grew. And then came the breaking point. When the ruler of Gober issued a decree forbidding anyone from following Usman dan Fodio, the people refused. They were willing to abandon their homes, their possessions, and their safety rather than abandon the man who had awakened their sense of justice. When the ruler ordered the arrest of Dan Fodio and his key supporters, the people rose. The conflict that followed became the spark that ignited a revolution. This moment marked the beginning of what would later be known as the Fulani Jihad, not a war of destruction, but a struggle for reform, justice, and the right to live under a system rooted in fairness. The movement swelled with herders, farmers, scholars, and traders who were tired of oppression and ready to fight for a better order. Under the guidance of Usman dan Fodio, they reorganized themselves with purpose and discipline. Strategies were discussed, roles were assigned. And what had once been a persecuted community in exile transformed into a powerful force, united by belief and shared suffering. Their victories began to reshape the political map of the entire region. One after another, towns and cities fell under their influence not through chaos, but through people willingly embracing a leader who offered them justice instead of tyranny. And as their influence expanded, so did their vision. For the first time, they saw clearly what they were building: a new state, a new order, a caliphate, a system where knowledge guided leadership, where justice stood above royalty, where moral authority mattered more than lineage. The foundations of the Sokoto Caliphate were forming stone by stone, principle by principle, victory by victory. But the old rulers were not ready to fall quietly. A storm was gathering. One that would challenge everything the movement had built and define the destiny of West Africa for generations. As the movement grew stronger, the territories surrounding Gober and beyond began to experience the tremors of change. For decades, the Hausa kingdoms had ruled with confidence, believing their power was unshakable. But the victories led by the followers of Usman dan Fodio began to reveal just how fragile the old order truly was. Communities once loyal to local kings now shifted their allegiance to Dan Fodio, drawn by his promise of justice, fairness, and moral leadership. The turning point came when entire Hausa towns opened their gates willingly, asking to be governed under Dan Fodio's reforms. Elders swore loyalty not out of fear, but out of hope for a future free from corruption and exploitation. This momentum settled even the strongest Hausa rulers. They watched as their influence faded, not because of force alone, but because their own subjects had grown weary of systems that punished them and enriched the few. Sensing the threat, the rulers formed alliances among themselves in an attempt to crush the uprising. Armies were raised quickly, horsemen, archers, foot soldiers, all determined to silence the movement once and for all. They believed that eliminating Dan Fodio would cause everything to collapse. But what they failed to understand was that the movement was no longer dependent on one man. It had become a collective belief, strengthened by hunger for justice and unity. When the Allied forces confronted the followers of Dan Fodio, they expected an easy victory. Yet the battles that followed shocked them. The disciplined ranks of the jihadists, built on loyalty, faith, and shared suffering, fought with a determination unmatched by the armies of the old kingdoms. Their tactics were strategic, their unity unwavering. Each victory boosted morale, strengthened alliances, and attracted even more supporters. During these campaigns, Usman Dan Fodio made a critical decision that would change everything. Recognizing that the movement had expanded across vast territories, he declared the need for a centralized system of governance, one that could bring stability, law, and organization to the lands they had liberated. It was no longer just a reform movement, it was becoming an empire. In 1804, a defining moment arrived. Usman Dan Fodio was formally proclaimed commander of the faithful Emir al-Mu'minin. This declaration signaled the birth of a new political and spiritual authority across the region. The movement was now recognized not just as a rebellion, but as a legitimate state. And from this moment emerged what would soon become the Sokoto Caliphate, destined to be one of the most powerful empires in African history. With this transition, leadership evolved. Dan Fodio focused more on guiding the movement's principles and spiritual direction, while his son, Muhammad Bello, and his brother, Abdullahi, took on major administrative and military responsibilities. Together, they established a system of governance grounded in scholarship, fairness, and discipline. Towns were reorganized, leaders were appointed based on merit rather than birthright, learning centers flourished, and justice became the standard by which all leaders were measured. As the caliphate expanded, its influence stretched across Hausa and New Planned, Yoruba border regions, and deep into the savannah. Trade routes revived under safer conditions, markets boomed, scholars traveled freely, and for the first time in generations, people could farm, trade, teach, and worship without constant fear of exploitation. But expansion also brought challenges. Old enemies plotted to regain lost power. Some territories resisted reform, and rival rulers, seeing the caliphate's rapid rise, began preparing for future confrontations. The success of the Jihad had reshaped regional power dynamics, making conflict almost inevitable. Yet despite the turbulence, one thing was clear: the Sokoto Caliphate was no longer an idea. It was a reality, solid, organized, and unstoppable. And as the movement settled into its new identity, a new chapter of leadership, governance, and expansion was about to unfold, one that would push the caliphate to its peak and test its strength like never before. With the foundations of the caliphate firmly established, a new era began, one marked by rapid expansion, sophisticated governance, and unprecedented unity across West Africa. Under the guidance of Usman Dan Fodio, now widely respected as the spiritual father of the new state, leadership passed increasingly into the capable hands of his son Muhammad Bello and his brother Abdullahi. Together, they transformed the caliphate from a revolutionary movement into a functioning empire. New emirates emerged across the vast territories they controlled. Each emirate was governed by a trusted leader, someone chosen not because of family ties or wealth, but because of integrity, scholarship, and loyalty to the caliphate's ideals. This was a radical departure from the old systems of power in the region, and it quickly became one of the reasons people embraced the new order so readily. For the first time, leadership felt accountable. Cities like Sokoto, Gwandu, Kano, Katsina, Zaria, and Bida experienced renewed prosperity. Markets grew as trade routes reopened under safer conditions. Caravans carrying leather, coconuts, textiles, salt, and gold traveled freely across the savannah, protected by the caliphate's organized security networks. Artisans and traders flourished, and tax systems once harsh and corrupt under the old kings became more predictable and fair. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in education. The Sokoto Caliphate became a magnet for scholars. Learning centers expanded rapidly, hosting debates, teaching legal principles, and copying manuscripts. Women, who had been marginalized in many previous systems, found themselves with access to scholars, books, and opportunities for intellectual growth. The Caliphate produced one of the most famous female scholars in African history, Nana Asma, daughter of Usman dan Fodio, whose writings and educational programs influenced thousands. Governance also became more structured. Mohammed Bello strengthened the administration, creating systems for record-keeping, taxation, legal arbitration, and regional oversight. Towns developed councils that settled disputes. Judges were appointed in every major district. The Caliphate grew into one of the most organized political systems on the continent, rivaling the great empires that had come before Mali and Songhai. Yet, with its challenges, the Caliphate's borders continued to stretch outward, reaching areas that had never experienced such centralized rule. Some regions resisted, others questioned the reforms, and rival kingdoms watching the Caliphate grow stronger began preparing for confrontation. The Yoruba states to the south, the Bornu Empire to the east, and various independent groups all sensed that a new political force was rising. Still, the momentum of the Caliphate was unstoppable. By the height of its influence, it controlled an area larger than many European countries combined. Its governance model inspired respect, its economy thrived, and its intellectual culture made it a beacon of scholarship across Africa. Through all this, Usman dan Fodio had started to evolve into something far greater than he had ever imagined. Surrounded by scholars, leaders, and thousands of loyal followers, he gradually stepped further into spiritual leadership, leaving the political reins firmly in the hands of Mohammed Bello. His writings continued to shape the moral foundation of the empire, while his legacy guided every emir and scholar across the Caliphate. What had begun as a struggle for justice had become one of the most powerful empires in African history. The Sokoto Caliphate now stood at its peak, unified, prosperous, respected, and feared, and the next chapter would determine how long its brilliance would shine and how far its influence would extend across the generations. As the Sokoto Caliphate reached its height, the empire's influence was undeniable. It had reshaped governance, revived scholarship, and unified diverse ethnic groups under a single administrative and spiritual umbrella. But as with every great civilization, new forces were rising beyond its borders, forces unlike any the Caliphate had faced before. And these forces were slowly moving southward, carrying ambitions far larger than trade or diplomacy. The 19th century brought new challenges that were not rooted in local conflicts or neighboring rivalries. European powers had begun carving Africa into spheres of influence, driven by competition, greed, and the hunger to control valuable territories. At first, the Caliphate observed these movements from a distance. The empire, confident in its stability, believed it could manage these interactions as it had handled foreign visitors for centuries. But this time, the intentions were different. As European influence deepened, the balance of power began to shift. Weapons more advanced than anything seen in the region were being supplied to rival groups. Old enemies found new allies, and British colonial officers, studying the political structure of the Caliphate, realized that dominating West Africa meant confronting its most powerful state. The Sokoto Caliphate had become too organized, too large, and too influential to be ignored. While internal reforms continued, cracks began to appear. Some emirates struggled with local disputes, others failed to fully implement the principles that had once made the Caliphate so strong. Leadership transitions created disagreements. The British exploited these weaknesses, using diplomacy when convenient and force when necessary. In the early 1900s, the tension reached its breaking point. The British marched toward the heart of the Caliphate with modern rifles, artillery, and military strategies shaped by global warfare. The emirs resisted with courage, determination, and unity, but the technological gap was overwhelming. One by one, major cities fell. The resistance was fierce, but the empire's forces were simply outmatched. By 1903, Sokoto, once the center of West African power, was captured, and the Caliphate's political authority was officially dissolved. Yet the story did not end there, and this is what they rarely tell you. Even after military defeat, the spiritual, cultural, and intellectual power of the Sokoto Caliphate did not vanish. The administrative structures, Islamic scholarship, and social systems the Caliphate had created remained deeply rooted in millions of lives. Many emirs retained significant influence as traditional leaders. Schools continued teaching manuscripts written by Usman dan Fodio, Abdullahi, and Muhammad Bello. Nana Asma U.S. educational legacy survived through womenist learning networks that lasted long after colonial flags were raised. The Caliphate's ideas about governance, justice, leadership, and community responsibility continued to shape the region long after its armies were silenced. Today, its influence is still visible in northern Nigeria, Niger, and parts of Cameroon. Its manuscripts are studied across the world. Its leaders are remembered as intellectual giants, and its historical role stands as one of the most impressive examples of African state-building ever recorded. Long before colonial powers drew their maps, long before European historians began documenting African history, the Sokoto Caliphate had already built a sophisticated empire, one with laws, education systems, diplomatic structures, thriving markets, and a legacy that refuses to fade. This is why the Sokoto Caliphate remains one of Africa's greatest untold stories. A story of courage, a story of knowledge, a story of unity, a story of people who rose from persecution and built an empire that reshaped West Africa. And even though the Caliphate fell to colonial force, its spirit, its teachings, its memory, its cultural impact continues to shape millions of lives today. If you've stayed with us to this point, then you now understand just how deeply the Sokoto Caliphate shaped West African history. But this story is far from over. There are still more hidden chapters, untold struggles, and powerful legacies waiting to be uncovered. So before you go, don't forget to hit the like button. It tells YouTube. This is the kind of African history the world needs to see. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on all notifications, because the next episode continues this incredible journey. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. And finally, share this video with someone who loves African history, culture, or powerful real-life stories. Let's rewrite our history together, one episode at a time. See you in the next video.